Tonight is the night Kamala Harris and Donald Trump will square off in the first and possibly only debate between the two before the election. From muting mics to drilling the candidates on the issues, the 90-minute debate might give undecided voters a little more to chew on as they make up their minds if they haven't already. Harris getting slammed for not only avoiding unscripted interviews and also for still having a fairly scant explanation of where she stands on the issues, where she stands now relative to her own positions just a few years ago. Here's independent journalist Glenn Greenwald's take.
She finally did something today that she has thus far refused to do. She posted a page on her campaign's website entitled, quote, "Issues." And it purports to finally advise the country, advise Americans on what she actually believes and intends to do if she becomes president. The problem is that the page really does nothing of the kind. It is as cliched and vapid as it is vague and evasive, thus compounding her growing problem that Americans, for good and obvious reason, say they have no idea who she really is or what she actually stands for, because the real answer is she believes in and stands for nothing.
Joining us now, I'm excited to have Glenn Greenwald of System Update with us here. Thanks so much for joining Rising.
Great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me on.
Before we even get to Kamala Harris in the debate, I have to ask you, I know you have weighed in on this, but we want you to weigh in on our show. The Cheneys are now big supporters of Kamala Harris, and Kamala Harris has welcomed that endorsement. You're someone who has criticized the Cheneys for a very, very, very long time. What does it say that the Democratic Party tent is now big enough for? It's big enough for the Cheneys, I guess. I don't know that it's big enough on the other end.
Well, I began my journalism career in large part in order to highlight and call attention to and warn of the attack on the foundations of our constitutional liberties and constitutional system by George Bush, who nobody thought was running anything at the time, and Dick Cheney, who people thought were the mastermind, and developed a very large and enthusiastic audience, primarily of Democrats and liberals, for doing so, because at the time they talked about Dick Cheney. This is not 100 years ago. This was 20 years ago. The way they now talk about Donald Trump. He was a white nationalist, a racist, somebody who was willing to go to war to drive up Halliburton stock, a torturer, etc. And not only that, when people like Bernie Sanders are now asked, like, what about Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney endorsing your party and your candidate, they'll say, oh, it's not that we have anything in agreement with them. It's just that Dick Cheney is, at the end of the day, no matter how much we disagree with him, a patriot who values American democracy and wants to preserve it. I was like, do you remember Bernie Sanders? Because you're definitely old enough to have lived through it. You were in Congress, in fact, that in 2000, the consensus among American liberals was that Dick Cheney was an enemy of democracy because he used 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court to steal the election and empower himself from the rightful owner, the rightful winner, Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. So to even hear that rationale is stunning. But I think the key point, there was a segment, I don't know if you saw it over the weekend, we covered it last night, where Liz Cheney went on ABC. Of course, she goes everywhere when she endorses Kamala, and was asked about her and her father's endorsement. And she didn't pretend that the only reason was this antipathy toward Trump. She said, and I think she's absolutely right, that from the perspective of her wing of the party's foreign policy, the Cheney family's foreign policy ideology, they are far closer to the Democratic party's worldview under people like Biden and Kamala than they are to the Republican Party under Donald Trump. And I think that has been the key, not just of the Cheneys, but the Bill Kristols and the David Frums and the Nicole Wallaces, all those people from that era who were talked about as fascist and racist, who are now very loyal and enthusiastic Democrats. It's not just because of antagonism toward Trump. It's because of a greater affinity for the Democratic Party's ideology than a Trump-led Republican Party provides them.
So on the front of the military-industrial complex, Donald Trump in his speeches talks about how we should be critical of the endless wars. But then he appointed Jim Mattis, who was a member of General Dynamics board of directors, to one of his cabinet secretaries in the Defense Division, Pat Shanahan, who was an executive with Boeing. Mark Esper was Raytheon's top lobbyist before being appointed to Trump's cabinet. How much do you think, this time around will really be different if Trump wins?
Yeah, just to add a couple more examples that I think are as significant is, Mike Pompeo is probably the classic pro-war Bush-Cheney Republican, and yet Trump had him run both the state CIA and then the State Department the entire 4 years. And then now we were hearing Nikki Haley is like the classic, Zionist-controlled neocon that we heard in the primary. She was appointed to be his ambassador to the UN. His administration was filled with people who represented ideology that he insists that he despises. That, in part, I think, is a byproduct of Trump's principal character and personality flaw, which is that, as everybody knows, you can easily manipulate him and flatter him by telling him how great he is, and then he will love you and appoint you to any position that you want, no matter what your ideology is. And I think the other real issue is that in order to actually take on long-standing, decades-old dogma and power of the permanent Washington faction, you need to have incredible amounts of discipline and dedication and devotion to that task. You need to be very courageous about confronting it, all the things that Donald Trump isn't. Nonetheless, just even his rhetorical deviations, and I also think there's some policy ones with things like Russia and Ukraine and the like, but even just the rhetorical deviations of, say, questioning the ongoing utility of NATO with the fall of the Soviet Union. Why do we need to be part of NATO? Why are we aligned with Western Europe? Why do we pay for their defenses? All the things that are sacred to the U.S. security state, to say nothing of his willingness to attack the CIA and the FBI is corrupt and part of the deep state. That just makes him so unpredictable, and not just unpredictable, but actually counterproductive to the people, the bipartisan establishment's power structure in Washington. And just the unpredictability alone makes him less preferable to Kamala, who, if she's nothing else, is a very reliable servant of power centers if it advances her career. And I think that's a big part of why there's this animosity toward and fear of Trump, not because he's some devoted revolutionary, but just because of his unpredictability.
So for the last several weeks, Kamala Harris, or through surrogates, if not herself, has been, signaling a dramatic shift on many policies she claimed to have supported in the 2019-2020 cycle, from energy policies, border-related policies, and other things. Bernie Sanders recently described that as, her basically giving up the positions she thinks are unpopular in order to win the election. He said, yeah, that's what she's doing. I think it contributes to, even if I like some of the policy flops, the shifts or the moves, it does contribute to this idea that she actually doesn't really stand for anything and is thus not a particularly inspiring figure. Is that an impression she's going to work at all to try to shake in this debate?
When she ran in 2019, she concluded that the only real sort of space that she had to become a successful candidate was she couldn't run as a centrist or an establishment status quo candidate because Joe Biden obviously occupied that, being Joe Biden, nor could she run as a sort of radical left-wing figure because that was Bernie Sanders. She had to be in the middle and sort of say, I'm definitely to the left of Joe Biden, but I'm also a little bit more pragmatic, more presentable. I don't look like this red revolutionary that just walked out of a 1927, socialist meeting the way Bernie Sanders does. And I think one of the reasons that her campaign failed so spectacularly, despite having every advantage, was because that was unconvincing. There was no Kamala Harris, that version of Kamala Harris like that prior to 2019. She was everything except that. And for her to now run as president, and not even explain herself, but through spokespeople, essentially reject every single defining position of her 2019 campaign. This isn't 30 years ago, just 4 years ago, the last election cycle, to now embrace completely different views, I think is contributing to the obviously accurate perception that her strategy is to run as a blank slate. And I think one of the things that Democrats got kind of deceived into believing was that if you look at polls for the last year and a half, the main message, the main consistent message was that people hated the choice of Trump versus Biden. Both had been around, both had been president, they're both 80-year-old men, they kind of just old. People just wanted something different, and they weren't being given anything different. So when Kamala Harris sort of descends from the mountaintop as this new, young, vibrant figure, she just is appealing in terms of how she moves and speaks and her energy level. Of course, there was this boost in the polls that was going to happen like a sugar high, because that's what people have been craving. But at some point, they're going to want to know, wait a minute, before we vote for this person to become president, who is she? What does she believe? What are her positions on the issues that we care about? And the strategy of just refusing to provide any of those answers, of not doing interviews, of not being specific, of running on this vibes campaign, I think is now starting to collapse. And you're seeing that in polls, not just in terms of her declining poll numbers and the decline of her lead over Trump in a lot of these states, but also the perception that's starting to appear in polls now that we just don't know enough about her. We don't know very much at all about who she is or what she believes. And that, as I said in that clip you showed last night, is because she is nobody. She's an empty, opportunistic careers vessel who believes in whatever she needs to believe in at the moment to advance her career. She's the classic sort of opportunistic politician with no core, no fixed set of unbending principles that good politicians either have to have or at least pretend that they have convincingly, and she can't do that.
So it does seem that she is, someone who can be convinced by popular rhetoric and popular movements. A lot of people were rejoicing on Twitter that her putting up policies on her website was the result of their concerted effort, very online, to complain about it. Her nominating Tim Walz does seem to be following this tide of public opinion in some way. She's also got Brian Deese as an economic advisor. He's progressive leaning, and it seems that her tune is changed on the economy in a similar way to how we saw Hillary Clinton talk about, Medicare for all, passing a public option, making healthcare more affordable, when Bernie Sanders was really running the numbers of exactly how we're going to pay for it. She was sort of in the camp of, we already have the money there. And she's right. A public option would be cheaper than the current, industrial complex we have around the provision of healthcare in the United States, cheaper by trillions, tens of trillions of dollars. It sounds like she's talking about economic policymaking in this common sense way of, well, we'll look at the return on investment rather than the initial price tag. Do you think we're going to hear more of this from her? Do you notice a shift with how she talks about the economy?
I mean, I think the way presidential candidates speak rhetorically is often among the least reliable predictors of what they're actually going to do once they win the election and get power in their hands. You see this a lot with Trump, too. Trump is embracing a lot more neoconservative rhetoric than he did previously, talking about how Israel won't exist if the Democrats win. He also is, saying he opposes a nationwide abortion ban. He just announced his support for legalizing marijuana because he wants to win more young people. I mean, so you see Trump doing the same thing, kind of speaking in a way that he hasn't previously spoken, that no one really is convinced he actually believes. So I don't think anybody, I mean, the single-payer healthcare system, or at least a public option, has always been more affordable. The reason why it doesn't happen is obvious, which is that the people who actually fund campaigns won't let it happen. And I don't know of anyone who thinks that Kamala Harris is the kind of person who's going to get into office and then start confronting and disrupting and subverting the people who have financed her entire political career. There's absolutely nothing to suggest that she is willing to do that. So, okay, I don't know, putting an issues page up 2 months before the election for somebody who never had to campaign for a single vote, who didn't participate in debates, who didn't have to give speeches, who didn't give interviews for this position, that seems like an extremely low bar to me to celebrate, especially given how vague that issues page was. I think choosing Tim Walz, just from a kind of pragmatic perspective, I can see easily, just strategically, not ideologically, why Tim Walz is a more appealing candidate than Josh Shapiro, who can just come off like as a very kind of slippery, ambitious politician. Tim Walz has that kind of Midwest appeal that Democrats are always craving. I don't know that was the byproduct of responding to ideological pressure from the left, but it certainly pleased the left. All I'm saying is that, yeah, of course you're going to get the version of Kamala Harris that she and her advisors believe is the best version to maximize their chances of winning elections. It just has nothing to do with the real Kamala Harris. And one of the things that voters do way better than journalists or political elites or political operatives is they smell inauthenticity. They can just, it's a stench that they can viscerally detect being condescended to, being patronized, being deceived. As I said, the best politicians like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama do condescend to the public and do deceive them, but they do it very well. They do it in a way the public doesn't know. But Kamala Harris is not some generational political talent. And I think this path that she's on of just trying to be cute and run on vibes and be as evasive as possible, not be locked down to any positions, is not going to serve her well, because the one thing I've seen consistently paying attention to politics is that is the one thing for which the American public has a real sort of sense is who is deceiving them and who is being authentic.
Glenn Greenwald, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.